Okay, so our next presentation is called Trauma and Healing Informed Principles, How Native Culture, Ceremony, and Tradition Are Key to Wellness of Native Communities. We're very pleased to have with us today Jilene Joseph, who is the Executive Director of the Native Wellness Institute. And I'm sorry here. Right page, I'm sorry. And Monica Yellow Owl, who is the Behavioral Health Manager for the Klamath Tribe and Family Services. So Monica and Jolene, welcome, and I will turn it over to you to provide any additional information you'd like to provide.
Okay, great. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. It seems kind of weird, like I'm just talking to myself on here. But I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to come and join you today. I've been in and out of the session since this morning, and it has been amazing. So I'm super happy to be here this afternoon and to share the time with Monica. So I'm going to go first, and then Monica's going to go second, and then we're going to leave some time at the end for questions. So I just want to start by just giving a little bit of background about myself. So as Leola said, my name is Jolene Joseph. My tribal name is Doone, and I was named after one of my great grandmothers. And I come from the White Clay people. The federal government calls us Grovant. And in our language, we call ourselves Aani or Aaninin for White Clay people. And I'm currently the executive director of the Native Wellness Institute. And this year, in the middle of this pandemic and revolution and all the stuff that's going on, we're celebrating our 20th anniversary. So we're very proud and excited for that. So I'm also a mother. I have 4 children that I gave birth to, and I also raised a nephew who was removed from his home, and a couple of other nephews and many other children as well. And I'm just really glad about the opportunity that you all have been given today to learn so much from so many people. I have learned a lot today from the different sessions as well, and I'm super glad that this particular session has been included. And so I'm 54 years old, and I've been doing this kind of work in Indian country since I was 19. And at 19, I was going into Indian boarding schools all across the country and working with the young people. And at that time, I was just learning about trauma. I was in college. I learned zero about trauma while I was in school, like zero. And my background is in community and public health education. And it wasn't until I started working in Indian country that I started learning about trauma from my mentors. And one of the things that I have come to know is that I descend from miracle survivors of genocide. Like, that's who I am. I descend from miracle survivors of genocide. And when I look at trauma in that way, it makes me look at not just the historical and intergenerational trauma, but it makes me look at the historical and intergenerational wisdom. And I think when we talk about historical and intergenerational trauma, we always have to talk about the historical and intergenerational wisdom as well. And so when I say that I descend from miracle survivors of genocide, it just makes me like sit up a little bit higher, and it makes me think about, you know, how awesome our ancestors were and the things that they did and the things that we're talking about today, you know, focusing on culture and ceremony and tradition, like those are the answers, right? But there's some things that we have to understand before that so we can better embrace culture and ceremony and tradition. And that really is digging deeper into trauma and the lasting impacts of it. And so I always have my trauma and healing ears on, if you will, and I'm always looking and listening for that word healing. And so since I've been doing this work since the 80s, I rarely would hear that word healing, like rarely. And then, you know, into the 90s, you hear it a little bit more, but not so much. You know, into the 2000s, you hear it a little bit more, but still not that much. And then finally, like in the last 5 years in particular, like I hear that word a lot, and it makes me happy because healing is the answer to trauma. And so because of trauma and oftentimes the unspoken rules that we grow up with, there's three in particular unspoken rules that I believe um, hold us back from healing or even talking about healing. And the unspoken rules of don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. And when we look at like Jane Middleton Moss as an example, and others who have done research around adult children of alcoholics or children that have experienced trauma, we grow up with those unspoken rules. And so that keeps a lot of our people from moving forward to a place of healing. And so my mentors and, you know, the people that have been doing this kind of work since the 70s, and even before that, really helped to pave the way for those of us that came behind them and helped us to better understand these unspoken rules so that we can help other people understand these unspoken rules. Because there was a time when we would be doing healing work and people would make fun of this kind of work. Oh, here comes those touchy-feely people. Oh, what are we going to do? Stand in a circle and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. And, you know, all those are like actual things that people would say about trying to do community healing work. But when we're trauma and healing informed, you know, we can understand that, right? And not take that personal and understand where they're coming from. So the importance of trauma then is helping us come to a place of healing, because where there has been trauma, healing is the answer. And so like I said, I love when I hear people use that word, and I've heard several people throughout the day today use that word healing. So that makes me happy, because what we're doing is we're starting to impact the norms that are in our families and the norms that are in our communities. And making healing okay, right? Making healing okay. And that's part of what we need to do. So one of the beautiful things about becoming more aware or more informed about trauma and healing, it helps us to better understand ourselves. It helps us to better understand the people in our families that we love and may live with. It helps us to understand people in our communities, and it helps us to understand people in our places of work, right? When we learn about trauma, and when we learn about trauma and we connect it to the behavior. And what that also does for us as individuals, it gives us an opportunity for ourselves to kind of like take a look at our own stuff. Because if we're going to be a supporter and a cheerleader of healing, then, you know, we need to do that ourselves. We need to work on our own selves too. And so I had mentioned Jane Middleton Moss, who has done a lot of work in the adult children of alcoholics movement. And she's also done a lot of work and research around trauma and really connecting trauma to current day behaviors. And so I just want to show a resource. If you could just allow me to share my screen. Or, okay, there it goes. Thanks. So I'm just going to show this slide. And this is a handout that we use in our work, and it's called the Trauma Web. And the reason it's called a trauma web, because when we get done filling it out, we have lines all over it, and it looks like a spider web. And so I did submit this, and so this should be in your email packet as well. But what we did was we took the work of Jane Middleton Moss and Lori Jonell, a Colville tribal member, and we put their work into this sheet that helps people take a look at trauma, historical and intergenerational trauma, and how that plays out in our lives today. Because oftentimes people will say, you know, geez, you're still talking about historical trauma, like just get over it already. And I totally agree that we do need to get over it, but what is the it? Like, what is the it that we have to get over? And so what this trauma web does, it helps us to identify that it. And the it is like the lasting behaviors. And so on the left-hand side of the trauma web, and I would encourage each of you to fill this out. on the now or later, but I'll just talk about it now. So in the left-hand column, we take a look at our life experience, our parents' life experience, or those that raised us, and our grandparents' life experiences. And so now we're looking at intergenerational trauma, right? And these are examples of trauma that resonate with us as tribal people. And so a couple of examples: death of a loved one, gambling addiction, emotional abuse, drug addiction, and then it goes on down the line. So if you or your parents or grandparents experienced any of those behaviors, you would draw a line from that example of trauma to you in the middle of the page. And so this helps us to start making the connection to the intergenerational trauma, right? And then helps us connect back to the historical trauma. So when those go unhealed, the behaviors continue, right? Because it changes our thinking, and then our thinking changes our behavior. And so the reason we take a look at our parents' or grandparents' life experience as well is because they raised us, right? And their unhealed trauma impacts us. Okay. So the right-hand column, these are the lasting, these are actually called the 21 behavioral characteristics. So in their research, they found that people that experience trauma display 21 behavioral characteristics. So all of the right-hand column: frequent periods of depression, difficulty hearing positives, fear of conflict and anger, a continuing sense of guilt, the need to be in control, as a few examples, those are the lasting behaviors. So what I always ask people to do is to think about the old you and the new you. And if the old you or the new you has displayed any of those behaviors on the right-hand side, to draw a line from those behaviors to you in the middle. And I always ask people as well to put the date on this trauma web and to save it and to come back and revisit it. Because sometimes what happens, like when I first started filling out this trauma web, I would draw lines on the right-hand side. And later, as I had more awareness, about my own self, I would draw more lines like, oh yeah, I need to draw a line from that too. So this becomes then a tool. This becomes a tool of helping us to move forward from trauma. So this is the trauma web. And when we talk about being trauma informed, it's like really understanding and having a good grasp on those behaviors on the right hand side. So we can see them clearly in ourselves, and then we can see them clearly in other people, not as a way to judge them, but as a way to better understand them. And this also, when we better understand people, it helps us not to take things personal. I mean, that's a big part of being trauma informed, right? Is like we hear that saying about understanding the difference between what's wrong with you, like looking at someone like that in a judgmental way, versus what happened to you. Okay, that's a big part of being trauma and healing informed. And so this trauma web then helps us to see those behaviors clearly. So let's see, I'm going to quit sharing my screen for a minute. So that resource is available to you, the trauma web. My goal is to have every human being on this earth fill out the trauma web, right? Because it becomes a tool. And the other thing that it helps us to do is we've oftentimes we make trauma this big, scary thing that we don't want to talk about or that we don't want to touch. And then so we don't. And then the cycles keep continuing, right? And so we need to not make trauma this big, scary thing. And we need to make trauma and healing, we need to put those things together because healing is the answer to trauma. We need to make it like a gift and an act of self-love. We need to make it a gift and an act of self-preservation. We need to make it a gift and an act to decolonize our own minds and our own behaviors. So we need to make it as a gift and a blessing. That's how we have to look at trauma and the healing from it, right? And then because when we do that, we show and we lead people through it that it is possible. It's not something that has to keep us in bed and under our covers and all of that. So that becomes a tool, the trauma web. So I wanted to share that. And then the next thing, I'm not seeing any. Well, we'll do questions at the end. So I shared about the lasting impacts of trauma. And one of the lasting impacts of trauma that often keeps ourselves or the family members that we work with from engaging in culture and ceremony and tradition and all the good things that we know that works. Well, trauma often keeps us from doing those things because of what I call cultural pain and shame. Cultural pain and shame. And I'm reminded of one time we were in this community doing a gathering. We were actually doing, it was called a GONA, Gathering of Native Americans. And instead of just, everybody sitting there and starting, we had everyone go out in the hallway. And the community had a big drum there, and the singer started, and we all danced in. We all had our own grand entry, and we danced in, and then we sat in our chairs, and then we started our day. Well, later in the day, this elder was there, and she was in her 70s. And she said that was the first time in her life, in her 70s, that she ever did anything Indian, was dancing into our grand entry to start our gathering. And then she told her story, and it was just like this powerful story of, growing up, and she was raised by her grandparents, and when someone would pull up into the front of the house, her grandmother would make everybody run out the back door, all the kids, and she would tell them to run out the back door and hide. So she grew up her whole life thinking that her grandmother was embarrassed of them. And so she grew up with like this deep shame that, geez, even my own grandmother was embarrassed of me. And when visitors came, she made us leave. Until this gathering, actually, when we started talking about, historical and intergenerational trauma and all of the things that happened to our people, she started connecting the dots for herself. She started connecting the dots, and she started realizing why her grandmother made them run out the back door to hide. She learned that her grandmother was actually protecting them. So those cars wouldn't come up and steal them and take them away, like what had happened to her. And so this whole new awareness and her heart opened, and she had forgiveness for her grandmother. Her heart opened, and she had forgiveness of herself for the kind of things that she thought, about her grandmother. And then in this gathering in her 70s, she danced in for the first time into her chair. I think about that a lot. And then later on the last day of this gathering, she shared about her own drinking and how that helps her pain. And then 8 months down the road, she told her cousin who had brought her to this gathering to get a hold of me and tell me that she still hadn't had a drink of alcohol since that gathering. Like, that's the profound impact it had on her. And that's what healing does for us, right? Healing is the answer to trauma. And so healing in the English language is actually a Hebrew-derived word that means to become whole. And we know that as tribal people, that means to become whole physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. So we know that in our healing journeys, healing just isn't about going to therapy, as an example, right? Like, there's all different kinds of ways to heal, and we all heal in different ways. And the young people that we serve, they're going to heal in different ways, probably in much different ways than what we heal as adults that are working with them, right? And so I want to share my screen again and just share a tool that we use that's called the healing plan. And so traditionally speaking, we had the protocols, and we had the tools, and we had the strategies, we had the opportunities that helped our people to heal. And of course, we know that trauma disrupted that. And so now we have to recreate those opportunities. And sometimes we have to recreate those protocols. And sometimes we have to create tools like this healing plan handout to help us to heal. And so in the work that we do, we'll use this healing plan, and we just ask people to fill out, and before this, we'll talk about examples. What are examples that we can do for ourselves to heal spiritually? What are examples that we can do to heal emotionally? Examples for mentally, examples for physically. And then we write those down on a piece of paper, and again, put the date on them. And then it helps us to hold ourselves accountable. We ask people to share with a neighbor or share in your group about what are the things that you're going to do for yourself to help your healing. And then this piece of paper helps in that accountability piece, right? So this is called a healing plan. So then this becomes another tool for us to use in our healing. And so I start sharing that. This was also shared. So this is another tool. Oh, someone was just asking me if I can enlarge my screen document. Sorry. Well, I just stopped sharing now, but the tool is available, and it should be in the handouts. And if not, I can email them out to folks. And please, everyone, feel welcome to use these in your personal lives. Feel free to use them in your professional lives. Like I said, I would like everybody on this earth to fill out the trauma web and to look out the healing plan. So healing, like trauma, the word healing can also kind of be like this big, ambiguous, word or thing. Like, what is this? And so, like I said, in the English language, healing is a Hebrew derived word that means to become whole. And we know that means to become whole physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. We can also take a look in our tribal languages and look at what does the word heal translate to in your tribal language. And when I go to communities all over, I ask the speakers, and most often it means something like to feel good, to feel good. And I always say, our creator, our ancestors wants us to feel good. Like we're supposed to feel good. It doesn't mean that we're going to feel good all the time, right? But a lot of the time we're supposed to feel good. So healing then, in terms of talking about historical and intergenerational trauma, we're talking about, a personal cleansing of all these things that we hold on to. Okay, the shame, the guilt, the resentment, the anger, the rage, all that kind of stuff that we hold on to that holds us back, right? It holds us back. So when we talk about healing, we're talking about letting go of some of those things that don't serve us in a good way, right? Some of that stuff that we hold on to might make us these angry, bitter, grouchy, chronic negative people. And when we see people like that in our families and in our communities, and when we have our trauma and healing lens on, we know that that's their trauma coming out of them, right? Their chronic negativity. That's a lasting impact of trauma. Um, the chronic negative, the grouchy, all of that, that's a lasting impact of trauma. And so when we see people like that, we can only imagine what are they carrying inside of them, right? So what healing does, it helps us to release that, right? To let go of that. And so in the work that we do lots of opportunities for letting go. And then we do more opportunities of letting go and more opportunities of letting go, because we know as human beings, we may let go of something, and maybe we're going to physically write it on a paper and crinkle it up and let it go, as an act of letting that go. And then what happens with our minds, we pick it right back up, right? So we have to let go again, and then we might pick it right back up again. So we have to let go again, right? So just like when we want to get better at basketball or beading or painting, we practice, right? So we can practice letting go. We can practice letting go. We can practice letting go until we get really good at it. And then we might come to a place of, something happens and we're just going to let go like that, right? Because we've practiced letting go, and we can become really good at letting go. And so there's so much more, and I know I'm talking really fast because I have so much to share, but I know I have an awesome co-presenter, and I just want to leave with a couple of things before I pass it on. When we're trauma and healing informed, one, yes, we have the awareness about trauma. We understand how it impacts the brain. We understand neurotrauma. So the things that happen, for example, maybe our mother drank when we were inside of her womb, and that impacted our neural connections, right? So there's neurotrauma. So being healing and trauma informed, we have to learn about all that stuff. Trauma on the brain and trauma and behaviors. We have to understand healing, and then we have to do our own healing work as well. And so healing is a gift, like I said. It's a gift to ourselves. It's a gift to our ancestors. It's a gift to our current family members, and it's a gift to our future family members as well. So that I want to just like leave that message with you all. And right now I'm super excited to pass it over to Monica, who I know is doing amazing work down in Southern Oregon, and I'm happy to be on this panel with her today. So I'm going to pass it over to Monica.
Thank you, Jillene. Again, my name is Monica Yellow Owl. I am the daughter of Deanna Wilson and the late Glenn Wilson. My grandparents are Harold and Della Wilson of Hat Creek, California, and Edison and Leatha Chiloquin of Chiloquin, Oregon. I was born and raised here in Klamath Falls, Oregon. I grew up all of my life in the community that I currently serve. I landed in the behavioral health field a little bit by accident. I've been working in behavioral health for 16 years now, and feel extremely fortunate that in my earliest years in behavioral health, my mentors were two of our tribal elders who had worked in the field lifelong until they took their last breath. And for several years, got to share office space with them and really take a lot of direction from them. So the work that I do speaks a lot to my experiences with them and the guidance that they gave me. It also speaks to the trauma that I went through also as a child and just growing up in a very normed social community. And then for my own personal experiences as an adult. And so I feel very fortunate to be given the gift of being a helper in my community. And I always say that I'm serving my community as the behavioral health manager for Klamath Tribal Health and Family Services, and I really appreciate the path that I'm on and the work that I do. Jillene touched on a lot of really important messages about healing as the remedy for trauma, providing opportunities to let go, and creating safe spaces and spiritual places and spaces for people to do their healing work. My portion of the presentation is going to focus a lot on those opportunities, those cultural opportunities to be able to heal and to build identity. Since most of you are working, since most of you attending this call today are working for and with systems, I want to talk a little bit about systems in general. You know, during the reservation and the boarding school eras, there was definitely a period of time that really reinforced for tribal parents that somebody else or another system knew how to care better for our own children. And some of that nuance lives on even today in systems. You know, regardless of the historical impacts that every single tribal nation has felt, all of these tribal nations have continually been striving for cultural connectedness, either individually or on a larger tribal scale. And I think that's really important to point out. The work that I do, we operate a outpatient behavioral health program. So we offer your traditional mental health counseling. We offer substance abuse treatment. In the last couple of years, we've integrated intensive case management. And now we're looking at recovery support services and reentry programs for our folks returning from incarceration. And you know, what I begin to understand about trauma is the severity of trauma also is correlated to the amount of cultural disconnect from traditional ways and traditional ways of thinking. And so this is something that every tribe across the country is really up against in solving. Is we have these large backpacks of historical trauma, and tribes are really at the table determining the best approach to drive up out of these valleys. and keep everybody on the bus while we're going out of these valleys. And so there has been an immense amount of tribal-led efforts and programming since the late 70s and the early 80s that really focus on the social tribalism enrichment or the cultural enrichment of our communities. A lot of our substance abuse programs in tribes were born out of grassroots efforts. I know here locally in the Klamath tribes, right at the end of termination, a grassroots effort provided a substance abuse treatment program that went on to live in our community for like 30 years. And then later on, we started to add in mental health. And like Jillene was saying, you never heard these words about healing or historical trauma or trauma until, maybe the last 10 to 15 years. And they've been really taking off, especially in like the last 5 years or 8 years. A lot of our prevention programs today are putting a heavy focus on tribal best practices. Working in this field in Oregon is really a blessing because of the acknowledgement of tribal best practices at the state level and the support of using state dollars to be able to provide cultural interventions and strategies in our communities. But a lot of our prevention programs are focusing on identity and this kind of reconstruction of traditions and culture, or this revival of traditions and culture through prevention work. That's really it's really beneficial. And in our behavioral health program, that's at the forefront of what we do. We're continually finding ways to weave in cultural knowledge and cultural practices into the behavioral health work that we do. It's very, very important. So, we're unearthing our traditional stories, our oral histories, to help shape how our ancestors once talked about behavioral health, how they talked about spirit, how they talked about healing. What were the words that they used? What were the songs that they sang during these times? What did our Indian doctors do when they were doctoring people? And what are the methods that they followed to be able to do that? And so I think my statement here is that I want to say that for those of you who are working for systems and you have this active efforts initiative to meet, that connection to tribal services is critical, because tribes are really putting a heavy focus on identity into the work that we do, and they're creating a lot of amazing strategies to serve their people. So, connection to tribal services is really critical at this stage. Also, the uniqueness of tribes, in that active efforts is not really a cookie cutter approach. That each tribal nation has such a unique history, even in the way that they were formed. I teach a lot about cultural awareness specific to the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin people in my community and beyond. And one of the first things I start out talking about is, even though there are several tribes in the region and we may share a landmark or a natural cornerstone, and I'll use Mount Shasta as an example. Mount Shasta is bordered by several tribal nations, the Modoc, the Shasta, the Pit River people, and others. And even though we can stand in our own territory and we can look south or look north or look east or look west, and we can see Mount Shasta, each of us in our own nation, in our own indigenous territory, have a very unique story about how we were created. I stand here in Klamath territory, and I know this story about the creator and his daughter, and this history that they had together to create the world and to create the people. And I go and I stand in Pit River country in the tribe that I'm enrolled in, and I have this other story and this understanding that the silver fox created the people. And so even though we stand in separate territories, we have this really unique nature about us. But those creation stories are really our proclamations of health in a way. They detail this is who you are as a individual, as a young man or a young woman, and this is who and where you come from. And so just like tribes have this uniqueness, so does the individual children that you're serving in your programs, that you are taking on that systemic responsibility, that system responsibility for. the individual children that you're serving also have this uniqueness about them, this genetic attachment to their ancestors. And so I look at things like active efforts as not just a cookie cutter approach. And I really like analogies when I explain things. And so I was thinking the other day about, how do I explain connection to identity? How do I explain that? And I was thinking, well, it's like a fly fisherman, a fly fisherman in his 50s or 60s, he didn't go to a fly fishing derby for 3 hours and watch fly fishermen, and he wasn't given like a book on fly fishermen and then all of a sudden he became one. It was like this consistent exposure to fly fishing. It was the way he felt when he did it, the support that he had when he did it, watching other people who were already great fly fishermen fishing. It was the process he went through of gathering all of his materials and taking pride in those materials that brought him into later years to be this really amazing fly fisherman. And that's how we have to look at cultural connectedness and cultural identity, is that it isn't just a 1 to 5 times exposure in a 3 to 4 hour program that builds this cultural connectedness. It's this lifelong work. It's these really meaningful connections to culture. And so we need that, we need that for our children. And so for those of you who are responsible, for providing active efforts, or, for our foster parents who have children in their homes, it isn't a situation of I need to take them to a powwow so I can check mark, the fact that I help them connect to their culture, but it's just this greater awareness and understanding that, building tribal identity, building an identity for yourself among your people, building that cultural connectedness is really about consistent, meaningful experiences, and that's what's important to tribes. And so connecting kids to tribes and the tribal programs that we're offering in this day and age is really, really critical. I have an example that I want to use, and I love to tell stories as a way to teach. And so I was thinking about when this opportunity to share with you guys came to me, and it was really about how our tribal communities using culture for interventions, or how are we putting culture at the forefront of healing. And I was thinking about maybe a story that I could share to really drive home what it is that we're trying to do and the depth in which we are trying to do it as tribes, considering the large amount of historical trauma that we carry, and that even our youngest population carries in their genetic expression. And, for those of you who may be familiar with the Klamath tribes, one of the 3 tribes that comprises the Klamath tribes is the Modoc people. And the Modoc War was one of the very last Indian wars to happen. It was one of the most expensive wars that took place, and it was one of the wars in one of the only Indian wars in which a general was killed. And when we look back on that history, it's not that long ago that these things happened, less than 200 years ago. And since first contact in 1826 up until 1872, so many things had happened to the Modoc people and their population. So war, smallpox disease, heavy cultural disruption, hanging of their leaders, relocation to Oklahoma. All of these really intense things happened. And from first contact to 1872, it's a period of about less than 50 years. About 75% of their population was decimated. And the narrative around all that in the newspapers at the time was, bloodthirsty savages only out to kill, maim, and destroy. Yet underneath of all that was significant mental health conditions as a result of chronic stress exposure, war, death, grief and loss, etc. And you fast forward this, and how does this play out in our tribal communities? Hopelessness, violence, stress, oppression, racism, lateral hate, triggering imagery, triggering single narratives, etc., etc., etc. And these are the things we battle up against a lot of times in our tribal programs, is how do we address this? You know, how are we going to create something that addresses all of these things? You know, like Jilene said, what is the it? The it can be defined by like 1,000 different things that we are that are in this like big stew pot that we're always trying to figure out how to cook. And you know, all of those things, you know, that we're talking about, oppression, racism, trauma, you know, they're perpetuated by elements of history. So our disconnect from our homeland in the Treaty of 1864 immediately meant that the Modocs would lose their entire homeland and be relocated to Klamath territory. It's perpetuated by single narrative history. So our story being told by non-tribal people in our own community, in our own county that we live in. It is perpetuated by the development of something like a national park where this war happened, and sort of the fun facts of history continually told. And it's also perpetuated by all of this perceived loss, like, you know, loss of land, loss of language, loss of culture, loss of ceremony. And so the question at the table is, how do we move beyond that? How do we transcend as tribal nations trauma to that degree, disruption to that degree? And, you know, personally, I was raised by both of my parents, but I was raised heavy Christian. From the moment I took my first breath, I was in the Indian Full Gospel Church world, and I lived in that world until I was like 14 years old. And so that was my spiritual framework, was organized religion. And when I got a little older in life is when I really started to look at my own tribal identity. Who am I as a for Klamath Modoc woman? What are the things that my own ancestors believed and felt about the spiritual world and the greater world? And so I began to follow those ways, you know, later when I was around 25 to 30 years old. So these walks and this cultural connectedness come later on in life for many people. Some of our families aren't born, you know, they don't have these things. Some of our children are born into homes where there is no spiritual foundation being built. There is no cultural connectedness. So there's kind of this spectrum that we're on as tribal people. No cultural connectedness because there was no opportunity, up to a lot of cultural connectedness because people in your family kept those things alive and had the opportunity to keep them alive. But, you know, later on in life, those two elders that I spoke about, they were big on connection to land, and they were big on connection to spiritual places. And I got to travel with them on several occasions down to Modoc country and be part of ceremonies and things that were happening down there. And following that, you know, being able to visualize a ancestral run, a spiritual run through those war sites, and being able to actualize that vision. And so, you know, year one, we ran over 90 miles from sunup till late in the night. And we were running through the old war sites, and we were singing Modoc songs, and we had these really profound experiences. And I remember it was really late at night when we came into the stronghold, you know, one of the last places that the Modocs held their ground. And tears from the whole group as we were running in together. It was pitch black, and the stars were out, and they were really bright. And we came down into the stronghold carrying our run staff, and everybody erupted in tears and joy. And I'll never forget that moment because it was really, really profound. And after that, you know, we continued every year to run, and we began to build our own ceremony. And we built our own run song. You know, we made our own run song from the language, and we began to have a morning protocol for the runners. And we began to incorporate traditional food. So we were harvesting deer off of the ancestral homeland of the Modoc people. Everything on our run staff came from Modoc territory. You know, all of those elements were really, really important. And as the years went on, the whole thing we were doing was we were retelling our story. We were reshaping how we were looking at that really traumatic event in time, you know, since his first contact till relocation, you know, that how do you take that trauma and really live with it? Well, it's like what Jillian said, you know, you reframe it. You reframe it in looking at the strengths of the people that you come from, and that you are entirely blessed to be a tribal person or a descendant from these nations that held out and held on through significant and horrific periods of trauma. And so you're reshaping it. You're also retelling your own narrative of the story. And so, you know, folks that are from our community that have been part of this run for, you know, the last 10 years say, when I used to go down to the lava beds, when I used to go down there, I felt so much hate and I felt so much anger. And now I go down there and all I think about is the run. And all I think about is when we're down here and we're singing our songs and we're spending the night on the land and we're waking up and we're all facing the sun and we're greeting the sun. And when we're waiting for the run staff, sometimes it's 20 to 45 minutes before the run staff comes, and it allows you that really quiet time to be reflective of your life, to be meditating, to be doing mindfulness based practices in the most indigenous and natural way that you possibly can. A lot of things come to people, you know, when you're singing songs in your people's language in places and spaces that we very rarely go, the way that the world responds to that, you know, the types of animals that we've been able to see, you know, the really significant cultural things and spiritual things that take place on that run is really profound. And so our goal there has been through time is how do you take all of that trauma and all of the impacts and effects of that trauma and create something that gives our people a meaningful experience, that it's reshaping narrative, that it's building cultural identity, it's building cultural connectedness to places and spaces that were theirs. And it's helping them understand that it doesn't matter whose name the land is on. You have this creation story that tells you that this is yours and it will always be yours. That spiritual places still hold power and they're just waiting for you to go back and reconnect. And that you can vision and you can actualize vision even in 2020. And so that's just one example of like the many ways that we're looking at behavioral health. We're looking at treating trauma with cultural interventions. We using the reignition of our culture to transcend trauma. And I think that, you know, I don't know if we'll ever entirely get over it, but I know that we can get through it and start speaking more to resiliency and more to healing than we ever do for trauma. And that's extremely important ways to be looking at this work. And so another strategy that we have is called Maklos Yemka, and that means the people are going. And we have been providing opportunities for our tribal members to connect to places and spaces that they may never have gotten the opportunity to go before. So we provide the vehicle and the food and the mechanisms to be able to drive them out to special places, teach them about the significance of that place, what was the cultural name of that location, you know, were there songs that were sung there, do men or women or both go there, you know, what are the kind of natural laws and rules about that place, and allow them to spend time there and meditate there and build a connection to that place. And that's how we're treating some of our substance abuse issues is developing this really strong connection to land and strong identity for our people. And a couple of years ago, we had a mental health retreat, and it was all men. And our whole goal for the mental health retreat was to introduce ACEs and have those hard conversations about especially sexual abuse among our male population. And it was a really powerful retreat. And one of the things we did was we rented a pontoon boat and we drove it out to the island that sits in the middle of Klamath Lake. And our whole goal there was to take them to a place, to a location that they probably always seen their entire life, just driving around the lake, but they have never been to it. They never set foot on it. And for all of them on the boat, it was the first time they ever had that experience. And as they were walking up the island, they were seeing rock stacks of their ancestors, and they saw a herd of deer like go over the mountain. And so they were taken up there, and they were allowed to just lay on top of the island and, meditate and pray and think. And it was a couple days later after that event, I was holding a talking circle, and one of the men that was on that retreat, I remember he came through the door. And I always anytime I think about this, I always think about him floating. I don't know why, but every time I think back to that period, it was like he floated into the building, and because he was so joyous. And he came in and he told me about this dream that he had when he left the island, and that all these tribal people were in these traditional canoes, and they were all paddling towards the island. And as he was telling me, I said, I think, you had a vision. It sounds like you had a vision. And do you remember how many canoes? And do you remember how many people? And who was there? And he said, I just remember it, like I think there was like five canoes maybe. And I said, we have to do that. We have to make these 5 canoes for whatever reason, this is coming to you, and we got to actualize it. And so we went to work on a process of securing some canoe trees. And, we worked through a lot of systems to get those trees. It was over a year-long experience working through all of the red tape just to secure some canoe trees. And finally we got everything in place, and we took van loads of men out to cut these canoe trees. And my coworker came back, and he was describing what the feeling was like. And he said, all the men were standing there, and the sawyer, he was getting ready to cut the tree. And he said there was like this, there was this just feeling that you could feel among the men, like excitement, but nervousness. And he said, and then they cut the tree, and you could hear it start to crack, and then it came over, and he said it hit, and the whole ground just shook everything. And the men just erupted like in this joy. And he said it reminded me of the Modoc War during the trial, when they brought our leaders up onto the scaffolding, and they hung the leaders, and when they dropped the handkerchief and the rope, it cut the rope, and they fell to their deaths, and this wave of grief flew over the people. He said it was the exact opposite. It was the exact opposite, but it was in the same depth as maybe what would have happened there. And so that really told us that we have to provide opportunities that are so extremely meaningful. Like Jilene was saying, we've had these circles where somebody had danced for their very first time as an elder, and it was so meaningful and so life-changing that it healed probably a large amount of trauma in one fell swoop. And so when we're looking as tribal communities, we're looking to rebuild identity, but really the whole goal is to transcend trauma and to transcend it using our own practices, our own knowledge, because for so many years through colonization, we were told that our knowledge didn't measure up, that things had to be best practice. They had to be rooted in research on non-tribal people, and that, we had to use other people's methods. We had to place our kids in other systems, and we didn't have the knowledge or the wherewithal or the experience to even treat our own people. And so I really appreciate all of the tribal nations across the country. I appreciate, the state, the county, and the state allies that are coming alongside tribes and recognizing that that we have a long history of success in helping our people, thousands of years of success in treating our own people through these indigenous practices and these connection to spirit and things like that. And so, I'm gonna wrap up my portion so we can open it up for any questions that the group may have. But really, my purpose here today was just to share a little bit of the deeper understanding of how tribes are doing this, and how we're looking at healing moving forward through reignition of our cultural practices and really actually putting them into play. So I thank you for being on the call today, for staying on and listening. And for those of you who might get something out of this, I send well wishes and good wishes to you to go on and carry these sentiments into the work that you do. So thank you, and I'll hand it back over to Jilene and Lola.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Jilene. I don't see any questions at this moment. I am seeing lots of thank you, thank you. This was amazing, beautiful presentation, incredible presentation. So thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, they're welcome to type them in the chat because we do have a couple of minutes.
I can do a little shout out and commercial.
That would be great.
I know Nakomi mentioned it earlier on the panel about the Native Teen Gathering. So the Native Teen Gathering is for Oregon tribal youth and foster care in tribal or urban areas. And we're doing it virtually, and it will be next week. So registration is open right now. So if anybody has a foster child, you can email info@nativewellness.com and we can get you the registration link. And then I also wanted to just give a shout out to every day at noon, the Native Wellness Institute offers what we call our Native Wellness Power Hour. And it's opportunities to focus on our own healing and wellness journeys. And it's every day we go Facebook Live on the Native Wellness Institute's Facebook page. And then we save them to our YouTube channel as well. So I just wanted to give a plug for that.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And it's almost 2:30, so we are going to take a break now.